Recording in progress. Okay, perfect. I've got to sit here because I'm actually recording this as well. So usually I wander and look at all you guys, but again, thank you. It is such a privilege to be with actually people here in live as opposed to on screen. And you guys have the privilege that the first time that I'm doing this presentation, my current area of research is really taking a look at ethics, artificial intelligence, and free will, how those intersect. And so as we go through this today, if you have questions, I look forward to them because that will help me, again, hone my research a little bit as we move forward. As we think about ethics, it is the way we take recording in progress. Let's see if we can get this working. I'm just going to stick this over here. It's going to do what it's going to do. We were evidently having connectivity issues, so I'll sort of watch for that. As we think about ethics, we start with values that we have within a context, and then those values move into action. We begin to think about what behaviors we're going to do. And you and I cannot get into anybody's head. We cannot know what their intentions are. We judge people by their behaviors and the way that we look at what they do and how they interact with us. And so as we think about the intersection of what we're trying to accomplish, our free will, artificial intelligence, and how we use all of the various prompts and supports that we have through technology, and then how we treat each other, the conversation becomes very fascinating indeed. So when we think about our values, the values are our ideals, things that are really important to us. One of the keys for values is that they give significance to our lives. They are one of the things that mean something to us. And each one of us in this room have different sets of values depending on your circumstances and who you are as a human being. As you take those values, you take them and they're reflected through the priorities you choose. You chose to come to this presentation with a little incentive, I understand, but we still have people who chose not to come. And we all have the kind of choices we make in our behaviors, how we respond to people, and what we choose to do. What happens is that these become acted on consistently and repeatedly. Now, one of the things about free will that is so fascinating is there's a body of research that seems to indicate that our brains act before our minds are aware of it. And yet what we know about something called brain plasticity is that our brains get rewired based on what we do habitually. And so while there's not a whole lot of research out there in terms of writing about our ethics, how we choose to treat people around brain plasticity, it works the same way. If you are habitually kind, you learn to be kind. If you're habitually honest, you learn to be honest. And this becomes reflected in the various ethical theories. So this is a wonderful presentation. Last week, I was at the University of North Georgia doing a presentation on AI and ethics, and this graphic was created by one of my co-panelists. And he was talking about the fact that people are now starting to not only do their meetings in person or with artificial intelligence, but they're creating avatars, and they're beginning to use technology to actually do the meetings. And as we begin to think about how we use technology, because artificial intelligence is nothing more than a technology on steroids, the question becomes, what do we do? Now, in the world of ethics, there is something called ethics taking and ethics making. Ethics taking is where you have the rules out there set for you. And in your law class, you learn what all those rules are. You know, how do you set up a contract? What do you do in terms of jurisdiction and power? And how do the various laws intersect? But there are areas that we call ethics making where there aren't rules yet. And artificial intelligence is one of those spaces. We don't really know how we're going to treat each other in this brand new space. President Biden sent out 2 weeks now an executive order inviting or actually requiring all of the agencies to put in place what the protocols are going to be and how they are going to use artificial intelligence. There's a whole lot of conversations. What do we do about privacy? What do we do about making sure that it's accurate and trustworthy? How do we put together the data sets to make sure that they are fair? Google put out a wonderful white paper that talked about 15 different ways that bias can show up in artificial intelligence, which was fascinating. Stanford Law School just put out a white paper that showed how well artificial intelligence can answer legal questions. By the way, ChatGPT 4.1, they were able to 90% of the time identify the correct legal issue, while the other 30 came in a close, or not even close seconds. But ChatGPT, it turned out, couldn't actually analyze a problem. They could find the issue, but they couldn't apply the law. That's where your heads, our heads as human beings, come into play. How did we get to where we are? 200 years ago, the expectation was that as we determined how we were going to treat each other, all of the information that we had was divinely revealed. You had your scriptures, depending on what tradition you were in, that got translated into law. You just followed it. Nobody was expected to think about much of anything. And then with the age of reason, the belief was that all truth could be discovered through reason and science. And the expectation was the same for ethics. Through our reason and our experience, we could discover the universal principles by which we should live. And that project was alive and well until about 1950. So shortly after, when I was in college many, many years ago, we had not moved. We were just starting to move to the notion that we really can't figure out all these universal principles. There is too much else going on. The disruption happened with two factors. First of all, we had evolution. As we began to grapple with what evolution meant, it meant everything was always in process. Everything was always changing. And we had to have our understandings of how to treat each other change along with that. The one, of course, that we think about the most in the United States is who is going to be a citizen and able to vote. And so you wind up with white males, and then you wind up with Black males, and then you wind up with white females. I was talking with a colleague, and it turned out that she, as a Black female, was the first Black female to vote in Florida in 1958. And so you realize how something as basic that we think about voting takes time to evolve so all people can be involved. The harder one was relativity. What is real is not discoverable. And what that means is we could sit and look at these chairs in this room, and I can look at them from one direction and I see little numbers on them. And those of you sitting back there do not see the little numbers at all unless you look to your left or your right. We can have a conversation about what color these really are and whether they're pleasant or not, whether they're comfortable or not. And all of those become judgments about the quality of the chairs. And none of that judgment part is provable. It's all personal understanding and opinion and experience. And so our understandings of how to treat each other then, rather than being absolute, become context driven. Now, the question becomes then, what do we do? So as people in my discipline, ethicists, now I'm a lawyer first, by the way, I taught this class for 25 years at Regis University, so I feel very much at home with law and ethics because that's what I did. What the ethicists started doing is they said, well, we have this first piece, which is biology. Who I am as a human person is inherited. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have siblings. I have two children, and one of them turned out shy and retiring, and one turned out absolutely outgoing and agreeable and sociable. And they were that way from about the first month or two that I noticed them on the planet. So there was some biology that is inherited. But that's not everything. The next part is our sociology. Your ethical lens that you figured out with your ethical lens inventory was pretty well put in place by the time you were 7. So in that first 7 to 8 years of your life, you figured out how you needed to respond to your environment to not graciously, but not be killed by your parents. How do I need to respond? How do I need to treat people? If I beat up on my younger sister, I'm going to get yelled at. If I don't make my bed, I'm going to get yelled at. What do I need to do to survive? And we are shaped by what our community tells us is right and wrong. Now, if you're in a community where everybody's alike, it's relatively simple because you're all treated the same, you have the same ethical norms. But when you come together like, here, where you're from different families in different corners of the world, you have different understandings of how to treat each other, and that becomes problematic. The most important, of course, is our psychology. How do we develop our understanding of how we can be? And this is where brain plasticity becomes very important, because as we grow up, we may decide that the way we were treated or were supposed to treat people when we were kids isn't so useful. I was raised in a neighborhood as a Protestant where Catholics were just not tolerated. We did not talk to each other. We didn't respond to each other. So when my sister decided at 21 to marry a Catholic, we had to have a very serious conversation about a family about whether our beliefs about Catholics were justified or not. We decided they really weren't. We needed to move on from that understanding. The Catholic tradition is well within Christianity, and our neighbors were wonderful human beings. So we began to change our behaviors. One of the tasks that you have as college students is to take what your parents taught you, what your community taught you, and evaluate it against new knowledge. Is this useful or not useful? Does this hold or not hold? And as we're moving into our understanding of technology, does our understanding of how to work with each other hold as well? When I was your age, I asked the question, if ethics is so clear, if everybody just follows their guts and you just do what's right, why are there so many different answers? I've got to tell you, having done this now for some 40 plus years, if I never hear again, just do what's right, I'll be a very happy woman, because I never knew what that was, because you had all these different answers. When you look at the political situation in Russia and Ukraine or Israel and Palestine, and you say, just do what's right, I don't know about you, but I don't know what's right. I have to use my skills of critical thinking, of analysis, my values, and begin to sort through what I think about those very complex situations. So I discovered that ethics depends on depends. It depends on the context in which you find yourself. Within the context of this classroom, you have certain protocols that we have agreed upon, and we behave, and you guys are paying attention and writing your notes, and that's wonderful. You move into a different context, you have different understandings of how you're supposed to behave. And in the socialization process, we all learn to move and change our behaviors based on the context in which we find each other. So this is a slide that you probably have seen before if you've done your ethical lens inventory, which I know you have because I looked at them all. This took me 7 years to figure out. As a professor, you come in and you get, associate, assistant professor, you get 7 years to show that you're a really good researcher. And the question that I asked is, as I looked at my business law textbook, we had 4 different ethical theories, 5, maybe 6. And the question was, which one is right? Because each of them claimed that they were the right theory. So I asked the question, is there a conversation that's happening separate from these ethical theories that makes some sense? And the answer is yes. Every ethical dilemma has 2 dimensions to it. The first is the relationship of the individual to the community. What do I as an individual get to say I'm going to do? How do I get to decide how I'm going to behave? And when does the community get to say, no, this is what you are going to do? Now, you and I have just come out of a period where it was really easy to explain this because everybody was either wearing masks or not. The individuals, we shut down everything in spring of 2020, regardless of what we wanted. As the community said, we need to isolate in order to be safe. Now we're coming back and trying to figure out what those rules look like and how we're going to be in relationship together. The same thing happens with artificial intelligence. You as an individual get to decide how you're going to use these tools. And the community gets to decide what kind of guardrails they're going to be on it. Last week I was with, maybe it was 2 weeks ago now, I was with my grandson in Orlando who's at a fencing contest, and Matthew is 16. So over dinner, we were talking about his assignment, and he has to write a paper, maybe he's probably finished it by now, on humanism. And he was sort of like, I don't know what to do, Grandma. So I said, well, let's see what ChatGPT says about humanism. And I typed it in, it came up 8 versions of humanism. Who knew? I told my daughter, she said, Mother, you can't do that. You can't teach them to cheat with ChatGPT. I said, I'm a scholar, I use it all the time. I didn't know there were 8 forms. How many of you guys knew there were 8 forms of humanism? I bet nobody in this room knew that. And then I could talk to Matthew about where do you go for your research and how do you validate it and how do you do what you need to do now that you're in the church to figure out how to get into the pews. And that's that relationship in terms of individuals and communities. How are you personally going to use it? What's going to be available with the technology? Head, heart. Our reason gives us processes and protocols that we need to follow. Our heart is the experience. We begin with our heart first. We have a situation that we have to respond to. I have a young man doing gardening and yard work for me. I'm so thankful because he's doing stuff I can't do. but he's sick and he doesn't have health care. And my immediate response was, how can I help him get health care? How can I make sure that he gets the care he needs? So my head kicked in. Okay, what do we do with getting healthcare through the Colorado systems? I'm from Denver. Can I find doctors who will help him? What do I do and how do I work the various processes, or do I just write a check, which I decided not to do? But that's the way these roll together. And it turns out that you all, as human beings, land in one of these four ethical lenses, and none of them are wrong. All of them are right. It just tells you where you start in your conversation. The reason it's important is that those values we talked about come differently in each of these lenses. So people up in the responsibilities lenses, you can see value of being truthful and ideal and principled, where people in the results lens, which by the way is the best lens, no matter what anybody tells you, we care about free will and good results. Over on the relationship lens, what is process and fairness? And then down the reputation lens, how can we be courageous and virtuous? By the way, even if you have people in your life who have never taken the ethical lens inventory, you can tell what lens they're in by which of these values they bring forward, because I can promise you they will bring forward one of them as the grounding for them making their ethical decisions. So how does that play out in real life? I was doing a consulting gig with a group of admission advisors at a major university, and they were getting ready to roll out a brand new program. And these admission advisors were fussing with each other about what they needed to do. So as part of the consulting, we always start with the ethical lens inventory. And it turns out that they were all accusing each other of lying and misrepresenting this new program to the learners. Well, it turned out that people in the responsibilities lens said, no new program exists until the Board of Trustees has signed off on it. Therefore, we cannot tell anybody we have a new degree program because the Board of Trustees hasn't signed off. The results lens, people said, well, no, people are making decisions and they're making choices, and this lasts over a 3 to 4 year period. How are we going to make sure then that they know what to do? And then the relationship people said, well, that's all cool, but everybody has to get the same information. We want our students to be treated fairly, where nobody is getting information the other person is not. And then the last people said, that's all very cool too, but we want people to trust us. So we have to be far enough along that we are giving good information. As they all talked about what behaviors counted for telling the truth, they realized they all had different definitions of what behaviors counted. They were accusing each other of being unethical when they just had different definitions. And then with that, they could then fashion a communication plan that honored all four of the lenses. And that's the value of the ethical lens inventory. Is you could start with yours, but you can work with people from different lenses to fashion a response to a situation that makes much more sense. This is one of your guys' classes, and I pulled up all three of them from Dr. Sorviaska's classes, and they're all looked about like this. And if you look at them, you notice you guys tilt up into the responsibilities lens. As we have done this work now, this slide says 500,000. We're getting closer to 700,000 people having done the ethical lens inventory. This data point has not changed much. Those of you in business programs tend to go up into the responsibilities lens. But as you notice here, you've got people in all lenses. You notice that people are sort of clustered towards the middle, which means that you're able to relate to other people pretty well. And we have this person way up here in the corner who would have a hard time playing well with people who don't think like him or her, because they are very clear about who they are and what they believe. But they would be balanced by this person down here, who is very clear about the emotions and caring about people and how to live in community. And if they were on a team together, they would fuss at each other about how best to do whatever the project was. If they were in an organization together, they would fuss about how the organization needed to move forward. And the community and the company would be better for it. As we go through this data point, we have a couple of anomalies, because people have asked me over the years, where do people land and how does this work? What we find is that if we pull it out by gender, down in the reputation lens, we have about 44% of the women down there, and we have about 44% of the men up in the responsibilities lens. And remember that second piece we talked about, socialization? That's the way that people are socialized. Women are socialized to ask questions as opposed to assert, to take a conciliatory role instead of an adversarial role. And we have to work to overcome that socialization process. There's no particular difference in age and part of the country, even in nationality. This all turns out about the same. Okay. So we have our values, we have our actions, and the question then becomes our shadow sign. Where can we be tempted? This is where the rubber in ethics hits the road. So I decided to do a case that's going to be in the ethics bowl next year, because I was so fascinated by this case. And we're going to use sort of as our case study. So faculty member assigned a paper, just like you guys get papers assigned all the time. You guys probably have heard of, maybe, Fiverr. And Fiverr is this lovely company where you can take your assignment and you can pay a certain amount of money, depending on the bid, to have the paper written for you. In this particular case, this paper was going to be written for $100, and you could have someone who would then write this paper. Now, before we get too far into that, we've done ghostwriting forever. So I worked for the Colorado Secretary of State. I wrote her speeches. She didn't say, Catherine wrote these speeches, I'm giving them. I did that. We have people who write books where people do the basic work for them and their name goes on them. We sort of have an expectation that you guys will do your own work, sort of an expectation. The faculty member worked for Fiverr and wrote the papers for his students, charging them $100 of whack to write his papers. They turned them into the faculty member, and they all got A's on their papers because, of course, he had written them, so he knew what they were. The faculty member made over $15,000 that year for writing papers for his students, for his classes through Fiverr. Now you sort of sit with this just a moment and you go, is there something wrong with this picture or not? Let's play with that just a little bit. When we take a look at what we label as unethical behavior, we start off with blind spots, places that we are not aware. So this is where you have a habitual response to something and you don't notice that you're being rude or you're being ungrateful or you're being harassing because it's just how you always behave. You and I are wired to make ourselves right. You and I hate more than anything else to have behavior that we think is wrong. And so we begin to defend ourselves and close ourselves down in tons of ways to not see our mistakes and not see our ethical dilemmas. Temptations are faced under stress. So the ethical dilemmas we get in business are things like you're at the end of your reporting cycle and it's time to put in your reports for, let's say, expenses, and you're asked to delay them for a quarter in order to not mess with the earnings. Or you've got a document that needs to be signed that really is not accurate, but you want to sign it because you don't want to get in trouble with whatever the reporting people are. You have a stressor point. I'm going to assume that those students who went to Fiverr had a stressor point that would be, I don't have enough time to write this paper. I don't know how to do it well. I can't do the research. I can't write it that well anyway. I've got some extra money sitting around, so I need to get this paper in because I've got so much of my life going on. Vices emerge as we choose to act unethically. And to the degree that we have this sort of tolerance in our community for not doing our own work, that shows up then when we're working with artificial intelligence, that becomes an interesting question of when it moves from a temptation under stress to choosing to act unethically, to choosing turn in something or to do something that doesn't represent our very best being. And that becomes the question when we're thinking about the situation between the faculty and the students, or any of the rest of the kinds of times that we use artificial intelligence. If there's one thing I'd like you to remember after being with me today, it is that small acts of moral courage shape the direction of our lives. Remember that brain plasticity thing? As over and over again, we practice picking up trash on the ground, we begin to have a reaction to picking that up, where our stomach literally feels badly if we don't. If we have a habitual space about always telling the truth as we define it, and we don't, we feel bad. And so that's that gut response we've talked about. So how do you begin to overcome that? How do you begin to sort out what to do in that situation? First of all, know yourself. What do you believe? Do you, as a student, have a belief that you should do your own work and turn it in because you're actually paying to learn something? Do you have a belief that faculty members should grade work and not do the work for you? Or do you believe that that kind of an exchange actually makes some sense? And then how do you behave after that? Watch for the patterns that you have. I notice that I love to get down to the last minute of an assignment because I get a huge adrenaline rush if I think I'm going to be late and then hurry up. And I've had to work really hard to break myself and to realize I do not need the adrenaline rush of being just barely on time in order to survive. And then act from the best you know at the time. So as we begin to think about how we do this, you and I have 4 basic needs. We have to get material social resources. The reason you're in college is to get a job. It's going to pay your bills, going to get you a mortgage, going to get you status, prestige, whatever it is that you think you want to get out of going to school. In that process, we have a search for the truth. What is the truth about what we have done? What is the truth about what we are doing? What is the truth about what we have gathered? How do we begin to play with that? We also have a need to be safe. How do we begin to protect our community? How do we protect ourselves? How do we make sure we don't get kicked out of school? How do we make sure that I don't get fired as a faculty member for writing my students' papers? And then how do I belong? How do I see myself as fitting? The process that we use is called a decision process where we begin to think about how to make good decisions. So the first thing we do is what you've learned in your law classes. What is the issue? What actually is here that needs to be answered? The first place that we take a look at is what are our intentions. When a faculty member assigns a paper in our little hypothetical, the expectation is the student's going to write it. When you turn in a paper, the expectation is the faculty member is going to read it and make some response. If that doesn't happen, if people believe faculty members aren't going to read anything, they're not going to do anything, there's no point in doing my own work anyway, I can't do it as well as they could do anyway, then you have a temptation to behave differently. The questions you ask around this are this: what is going to make me happy? I always tell students, it's really kind of fascinating, and this has not changed one, that you and I are dancing a dance. My dance as a faculty member is to make sure that people learn as much as possible, master this wonderful world of business law, which I find so exciting, and most of you hopefully do too. Your dance is to get out of the class with as high a grade as possible, doing as little work as possible. And we know that's our dance. So how do we mutually engage in that dance so that I do my very best as a faculty, you do your very best as a student, and we move ahead? What consequences are we willing to have? What are mutually good results? We then move into that to what we call our ethical boundaries. What are the expectations? Now, I know that in your class you have learned about contracts. What are we agreed to do? And whenever you hear a presentation on ethics, you hear about trust and how important trust is and what that means. Trust is based on fulfilled expectations. What do we agree that we're going to do together? And in this one, we ask questions like, what principles are important? What are my responsibilities? How do I fulfill my duties? And as you think about that with our little hypothetical, you can imagine what the duties are for the faculty, what they are for the students, and how we are going to be engaging together. As we then move into community, we learn how to exercise agility. What are the differences? How do people contribute to variety? How can I listen to you and figure out our knowledge, our values, our experience, and to be interdependent? Each of the ethical theories gives us some foundation for this conversation. I make choices that contribute to my happiness. I use reason to determine the principles by which I am going to live. Together, we decide and implement processes to assure justice, and we decide what counts as virtuous living. And this is the project that we're engaged in with artificial intelligence, because we don't know what these rules are. What are we going to say about the various kinds of things that we do and we say together? Together, you and I are going to construct our reality. Together, you and I are going to determine what counts for and is a good experience. Every decision you make in your class, in your life, will change the direction of your life a little bit and change the world as well. And as we learn together to be in relationship with each other, we figure out the value of the whole. So we now get to choose an option for action. As we look at the undelivered communications that happen, we begin to think about how we begin to share with each other our expectations. We begin to think about, if I was the dean of that faculty member, what would I do? If I was Fiverr, how would I respond to that? Is this even a business that we should be in? What are our expectations for ourselves in this setting? In this process, we need to think about what is fundamentally fair. How do we hear people with no power? How do we care for those folks? How do we make sure that the voices of all the folks who are involved can be heard? And then we act with courage. What is going to set a good example? What is required by my role as a faculty member, as a student? What is required by my role as a user of artificial intelligence? And from then, we commit to growth. Each of you, as you are finishing up and working through your college experience here, has to decide what your best self is. Each of you have to make a decision about how you're going to use these various tools that are available to us in a way that makes sense, and it's going to enhance you as a human person. Each of us as community members get to decide how we're going to construct a reality that's going to support all of us. What are we going to decide is the way that we can most meaningfully use these tools that we have available. And then acting on those makes some sense. So as we begin to move forward, we want to embrace fallibility. We want to be willing to change our ideas and change our minds as we seek the truth. We want to live within the tension of those problems as we learn how to create an opportunity for everybody to thrive. And then we cultivate our imagination. We begin to think of ways that we can be in community together that make some sense. Out of that, then we end up by being reflective. How do we then think about who we want to be, correct, and move forward? So I would ask and invite you to think about 4 core questions in any ethical dilemma you've got. What do you really want? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you believe about the situation? What principles are important? How do you use your personal power? And are you, in fact, being a good example? And as you face your ethical dilemmas throughout your day, throughout your life, these 4 questions will provide you with guidance about how to live in uncertain times. Out of that, we have 3 things. Every one of you people in this room, every person on the planet has value. And I can find value in it as opposed to saying, oh my God, I need to talk to this person to get ahead of my career. Or I need to make this connection in order to get the next perk that I'm going to get. All of us have an opportunity to make free and directed choices, to live effectively and to live responsibly. You all make a difference as we begin to move into this brave new world of new technology, as we think about how we're going to be in relationship with each other. The decisions you make as individuals and as a group begin to shape our conversation and shape our community together. So with that, I'm going to open it up, and I know that we have had the opportunity to have questions. So I am going to take just a minute and turn off the recording, and then we will take your questions that you might have.